A warm welcome to you all, either here in person or watching online, to this year's scientific symposium, which is entitled Make Illiberalism Great Again, How the Orbán Government is Forging Transnational Alliances. As you see, the title of this year's symposium echoes Donald Trump's slogan, Make America Great Again. And this adaptation is meant to capture two closely interconnected developments. First, the emergence of a transnational liberal network spearheaded by Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán. And second, the very close and political and ideological relationship between Orbán and US President Donald Trump. And I think the majority of you, or all of you know, Orbán has long been known for pursuing a foreign policy that openly diverges from the European Union's consensus. He has cultivated close ties not only with Trump, but also with Russia's Vladimir Putin or with China's Xi Jinping. However, the story is not simply one of foreign policy deviation. What we are witnessing is something far more ambitious and consequential. And only a few years ago, Viktor Orbán was widely regarded as a kind of historical aberration within the European Union, a nationalist populist outlier challenging the liberal democratic mainstream. Today, however, his brand of radical right populism and illiberal governance has evolved into a model for other would-be authoritarian leaders. Donald Trump has repeatedly praised Orbán as a great leader and appears to have copied several elements of Orbán's illiberal playbook. His Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, visited both Orbán and his ideological ally, Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico, following the Munich Security Conference. And these gestures signal the depth of political affinity and strategic coordination. Yet Orbán's ambitions extend well beyond cultivating ties with the United States. While frequently attacking the European Union, he has simultaneously pledged to march on Brussels and reshape the EU from within. And these ambitions are not merely just political slogans. Over the past decade, Orbán has invested significant financial and political capital into constructing a dense transnational network of political actors, think tanks, foundations, media outlets, and government-organized NGOs, so-called gungos. And the purpose of this network is to promote illiberalism as a counter-narrative to what Orbán and his allies portray as a morally and politically decadent liberal international order that emerged after the fall of the Iron Curtain.
So hello also from my side. I'm really happy that we're talking today about this very important topic, especially in the context of the approaching elections in Hungary and the most recent experience of Rubio traveling, for example, to Hungary and the last steps in its foreign policy. When we thought about how we would assemble this panel, we took experiences both from what we read in media, but also what we heard from the region, and gathered, I think, three very relevant contexts. The first context is, of course, the transatlantic relationship, which has been debated a lot, but I think not really in depth. So this will be a very important part to touch upon, very visible, for example, by the holding of the CPAC conference a couple of years ago in Budapest, for example. The second area will be the European Union, where Hungary is very visible, but where we have hardly ever heard of the network of these think tanks that we're talking about. For example, the MCC and others, which are very important and also very well equipped with resources. And on the other hand, of course, also the more visible part, like the Patriots for Europe faction in the European Parliament that has emerged, and is also an important tool. And last but not least, of course, also the Western Balkans, which are a very important area of Hungarian interest, but also of EU interest, of course, and where it also applies similar tools, but we're going to have a look at, is the strategy similar or is it probably a different one in this region? So I'm very happy that we have a great panel to discuss these questions with. And I'm very happy to welcome Ivana Ranković from the Belgrade Center for Security Policy in Belgrade. She specializes in international politics and security with a regional focus on the Western Balkans. And she's especially interested in foreign influences in the region, among them Russia, China, but also Hungary. So a warm welcome to you, Ivana. Then I'm very happy to welcome Zsuzsanna Végh, who is a German Marshall Fund fellow in German Marshall Fund of the United States fellow in Berlin, and also associate researcher at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And she's pursuing her PhD in comparative politics at the Europa-Universität Viadrina, focusing on radical right parties' influence on foreign policy in Central Europe. And her main areas of interest include the transnational networking of the far right and its impact on foreign policy and democracy, democratic backsliding and resilience, with a particular focus on Central Europe and, of course, Hungary. So the very topic of our meeting today. So welcome also, Zsuzsanna. And I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Gábor Scheiring, who is an assistant professor at Georgetown University in Qatar, with previous appointments at Harvard University, the University of Cambridge, Bocconi University. And his research examines why and how the crisis of liberal globalism becomes embodied in individual suffering. And he's actually also the author of an award-winning book, which is called The Retreat of Liberal Democracy, which I think is also highly relevant to this discussion. And between 2010 and 2014, so just after Viktor Orbán regained power, he was also a member of parliament for the Hungarian party LNP in the Hungarian Green Party in Budapest. So welcome also, Gábor. So we're going to start now with 3 brief presentations, then have a discussion in the panel, and then open up to the general public to have a broader discussion. So I'm looking forward to Zsuzsanna's presentation.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. And indeed, this is a very timely panel discussion with the Hungarian election just about 6 weeks away. I will be talking about the European angle of the Hungarian governing party's alliance building. But before giving you an overview about the main actors and goals, I thought I also give you a little bit of a background and context, how it came about, because the development of such a network driven by a relatively small Central European country might be quite surprising. And it's quite a specific constellation that the Hungarian governing party could really achieve what it has over the past few years. I have a few arguments that I thought would highlight if also the projector cooperates. Yeah, should go. Thank you. And ultimately, what I want to argue is that what we have seen as a result of several years of strategic investment into networking, using financial tools and also media influence, has led to the establishment of a stable network, the culmination in Europe of which we see in the establishment of the Patriots for Europe group in the European Parliament. This suggests that this networking has a strong European focus and agenda. It works through empowering ideological allies who challenge liberal democratic institutions as well as the authority of the European Union in member states, seeks to support their rise into power, ultimately to build a network of allied forces who can, by advocating and pursuing the agenda of a Europe of nation states, can challenge the European cooperation, and over time would have the ability to hamper joint decision-making in the EU that would push for a further integration. These forces, led by and supported by Fidesz, are ultimately disinterested in that, and they would like to see a Europe that is pursuing at most intergovernmental cooperation, but no deeper integration. The alliance building as such is a tool for that, and not just an ad hoc cooperation. So where is this coming from, and how did we get here?
Maybe just say next slide.
Yeah, could I please get some support with that, because this does not seem to work. Thank you. So the roots of the international alliance building are actually domestic. They are rooted in a couple domestic developments that we have seen unfold between 2010 and roughly 2018. One has been the domestic erosion of democracy under Fidesz that increasingly led to tensions with Fidesz's traditional allies in the European People's Party, and rising clashes between these political forces. At the same time, we have also seen a shift in the ideology of Fidesz, partly under pressure by the rising support of the far-right Jobbik in Hungary, and also by the changing opportunity structure, the refugee and migration crisis being case in point that fueled Fidesz's rhetoric, or Fidesz used as an entry point to shift further to the right. And finally, what I think was a breaking point came in 2018-21 with the start of the Article 7 procedure against Hungary and the eventual departure of Fidesz from EPP that necessitated that the governing party seeks alternative allies on the European level. The driver for this was to avoid being in the political no man's land in the European scene and look for new allies. The rise of far-right forces across Europe gave a good opportunity to look elsewhere. But what I think is really important is that Fidesz by this time was in the position that it had necessary financial resources to support this network building, that it could draw not only from party coffers, but also from the state budget. And what we have seen here in the case of Hungary is really blurring the lines between party and state, instrumentalizing state capture towards the party's own international agenda as well. Two levels I wanted to touch on is the building of the party alliance, where the party itself is the main actor. The goal here is, as I mentioned, to build new connections to like-minded forces who on the European level support a similar agenda with Fidesz. This is not an agenda that has a detailed policy map where parties overlap on every issue, but rather the key connecting element is the challenge to the European Union. In this case, the roots of this network building were in Central Europe, where Fidesz did have already existing partnerships, first and foremost with the Law and Justice Party in Poland, but also the ANO in Czech Republic, where it could really build on a national conservative ideological background. But the refugee and migration crisis was the moment where it could expand its rhetoric encompass in it a nativist xenophobic element that opened the way towards like-minded forces in Western Europe. And in this regard, Fidesz was the first and I would say most successful party so far to really engage with Western European political forces. Organizationally and instrumentally, it had the know-how from its previous engagements in the European People's Party. And that is a know-how that it can actually turn into network building now when it's putting together the Patriots of Europe. As the process unfolded, I think what we have seen is really the subjugation of traditional diplomacy to the party's very own interest, at times at the detriment of interstate relations as well. The tools for the network building to engage with like-minded forces was, of course, providing political support. This is more relevant in Central European contexts, but also in some cases providing financial support to parties such as Le Pen's Rassemblement National, which received a campaign loan from a bank connected to Fidesz cronies, but also Vox that couldn't secure loans from Spanish banks could turn to Hungarian banks connected to Fidesz. As a result, as I mentioned, the Patriots for Europe was brought about and co-funded with the Austrian Freedom Party, a Freedom Party of Austria, and ANO in the Czech Republic. And what I think is interesting here, apart from the fact that this is the first far-right political group co-funded by Western and Central and Eastern European parties, is that the core element of their ideology that unites them is actually a sovereigntist agenda that broadens the opportunity to pull in parties beyond the far right and also engage with Eurosceptic forces who may not have a very strong nativist agenda per se, case in point being ANO in the Czech Republic. This is not only a political project, I would say, but a much broader ideological or counter-hegemonic project. And their Fidesz is actually building on a broader network of actors. Some of these I have highlighted, which on the European scene are really the key. These are gongos, or government-organized non-governmental organizations that function as network builders, disseminators, and legitimizers of Fidesz's agenda. The biggest actor on the European scene is the Matthias Corvinus Collegium, which is an organization that focuses its activities on raising a new generation of both party cadres, but also intellectual elites who endorse similar attitudes and views as Fidesz. Its programs run from primary school to university, but also the organization has built a research network where it cooperates, provides fellowships, very well-funded fellowships for like-minded intellectuals, academics, public intellectuals, and media personalities in Budapest who publish and talk about the successes as they were of the Hungarian governing party. MCC, Matthias Corvinus Collegium, has a Brussels branch, which also publishes on matters of European relevance. The other organization that has a key role in the European networking, but also in legitimizing Fidesz's own agenda domestically, is the Center for Fundamental Rights. This is an organization that has been partnering for years with the Conservative Political Action Conference, CPAC, in the United States, and has been organizing European gatherings annually. The reason why I highlight it here, although it does have very strong ties transatlantically, is because the CPAC Hungary conference has been the first European spin-off of CPAC, and it has provided an important platform to bring together European and American politicians to network, to develop shared agendas and exchange practices and know-how. One more thing to note here is the financial background of these organizations. The Matthias Corvinus College is endowed with a massive 1.3 billion euro stock package in Hungary's two biggest companies, MOL, which is an energy company, and Richter, which is a pharmaceutical company. This stock package belonged to the Hungarian state, and the government, with its own decision, transferred this stock package to a private foundation that is behind MCC. For context, this 1.3 billion euro package amounts to about 1% of the Hungarian GDP. And the organization is using the dividends of this. The Center for Fundamental Rights have been receiving state budget support, also in the billions, over the past years. So CPAC Hungary, for example, has been funded by the Hungarian taxpayers. I will move on to the next slide, please. Why does it matter? What are the avenues of influence? And what can be achieved? Fidesz's theory of change with this networking is to empower like-minded forces nationally while building their international network. The idea is that there is a process of stabilizing the connections, providing a shared experience of socialization where the actors can rely on each other, exposed to each other regularly. With the current trends, some of the parties have already or have very good chances to rise into governmental positions. And that's when the impact actually becomes relevant, as they are becoming represented in the European Council and the Council of the European Union. In the meantime, participation in the European Parliament through the Patriots provides an additional arena to raise visibility, to develop shared agendas, even if these will never be completely identical across the various countries. Their visions are supported by the organizations that I have just mentioned, like MCC or the Center for Fundamental Rights, and by creating rhetorical fuel and material, they support the agenda building of these actors. The entry points like MCC, like its festivals and events, as well as CPAC Hungary, also provide an entry point for non-European actors to engage with relatively easily and at low cost with European like-minded forces. And as long as Fidesz is in power, they can continue the cooperation. The question will come, what happens if Fidesz loses the election, whether this network then collapses. Ultimately, I would argue that it doesn't. Fidesz is very deeply embedded in European party structures by now. That's one thing. The Patriots of Europe will continue to be an important arena of cooperation. And second, whether the intellectual network would disappear, I also think it will not. This is a very well-established network. Hungary is a node in this, but is not the only financer of the whole network. And even if I mentioned the financial background of the organizations, it is maybe a more straightforward matter to potentially cut funding for organizations like the Center for Fundamental Rights, which have been receiving state support, that might disappear. But the stock package that MCC has gotten is now in private hands, so it's definitely not straightforward to remove access to that pool of money. So even if Fidesz is out of power, we will see this networking going on. Thank you very much, and I'm very happy to answer questions after the other presentations.
So, hello everyone, and thank you very much for the organizers for the invitation. It's really a hugely important topic, and for many reasons that Zsuzsanna already mentioned. What I would like to emphasize also is we're talking about a very specific instance of counter-hegemonic foreign policy that is designed to last for the long run. It's a well-thought-through strategy from a state that really punches far above its weight. And this is something, a network and a set of institutions that have been laid down throughout years with endowed foundations that sit on their own money. So this is a very ambitious foreign policy strategy. And it's very important to realize this because a bit too often illiberalism and Orbán and populist governments are kind of treated as these they cannot govern, they don't know what they're doing, and it will pass, and we just have to give them responsibility of government, and it will turn out that they can't do anything. Well, the evidence is that, at least in the case of Hungary, they do a lot with these power, and they do undermine the international liberal world order, which has been already in crisis, but they are adding fuel to the fire. And this is something really puzzling, both from a theoretical and empirical perspective. So existing foreign policy and international relations theories can't really explain this kind of behavior. We don't really have good theories for small state counter-hegemonic foreign policy actions. What most of the literature says is that small states do either bandwagon or they specialize in kind of niche expertise, but it's very rare that you would have a small state that wholesale goes against the liberal world order. You have a few instances like Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, but it's really rare. So I think we need to really work on this hard, both for theoretical reasons, but also for political reasons, because if we want to develop proper responses to this phenomenon, we need proper understanding. And my contribution is one step in that direction, where I propose this notion of small state counter-hegemonic foreign policy, which is systematic investment of state resources in transnational networks, institutions, and ideational infrastructure aimed at delegitimizing the existing hegemonic order and constructing an alternative. It occurs during hegemonic transitions when the prevailing common sense loses legitimacy. And it's deliberately a Gramscian language, because this is, I think, a Gramscian strategy. And Viktor Orbán is the most prominent pupil of this great 20th century Marxist communist philosopher from Italy, Antonio Gramsci. Orbán has studied Gramsci's works during his university years, and now he's putting it into practice. And I'm going to focus just briefly on the US transatlantic side of this. This really overlaps with the strategy is more or less the same for the European theater. And I identified 8 kind of mechanisms of the small state foreign policy, counter-hegemonic foreign policy strategy: institutional arbitrage, transactional access, coalition brokerage, counter-hegemonic financing, media colonization, narrative translation, cadre formation, producing organic intellectuals, and laboratory diplomacy. So you can divide this into 2 kind of categories. One is about resources and relating to other actors, and the other is more like in the sphere of ideas. So these are 4+4 mechanisms. So let me then just briefly give some example of how this actually looks like. So let's Let's move to the first mechanism. If you can also switch the slides, please. So institutional arbitrage is really critical, and that's why it's the first one. So it's a kind of parasitic exploitation of the hegemonic institutions. So Orbán has not withdrawn from the EU. He's also a member of the UN. So he's staying inside what he perceived as the crumbling liberal world order and does everything to exploit those resources that these institutions give. And he's really smart and really efficient in exploiting the EU with all its kind of cumbersome decision-making. And the roots of this kind of hegemonic strategy are domestic. The liberal hegemony globally in crisis was first experienced through provinces of Eastern Europe, including Hungary. And this was the factor that delegitimized the pre-2010 governments. And Viktor Orbán capitalized on this kind of legitimacy crisis. And you know that he was in power from 1998 to 2002. And what he learned was that, this is his words, we were in government, but we had no power. So governing is one thing, but having power is another. So he invested already in opposition to build these extra governmental fortifications of power, which then, as the global liberalism or liberal globalism really entered into a crisis mode around 2008, kind of were scaled up at the national level and then later on at the international level. So he was also using already pre-Trump era connections to the Republican Party, exploiting EU leverage. These are all kind of instances that show that he is really using the existing world order, and this has long roots as this has been upscaled to what we see now. The second really critical element is media colonization. Again, starting domestically, buying up independent media, using public broadcasting for propaganda purposes. I'm sure you've heard about this foundation that consolidates more than 500 media outlets. So that's the domestic leg. But it has been also, again, upscaled internationally using English language media outlets. I have to say, in most cases, these are commercially not successful, especially the English language ones. But nevertheless, they kind of promote the liberal Orbánist agenda. They also promote sponsored content. The most important one was kind of managing to invite Tucker Carlson through his father's PR firm. Or Euronews. It's debatable how much control actually Orbán has over it, but has clearly provided resources for an investor to buy it. And if you look carefully at the content in Euronews, they are actually carefully inviting experts that promote the liberal agenda, both on air, but also kind of on their website. The third element, if you can move ahead, is what I call narrative translation. So this is going in two directions. So it's a bidirectional adaptation of counter-hegemonic ideas and institutional practices across political contexts. So you've heard about his anti-Soros campaigning. This has been perfected in a Hungarian laboratory, and then it has been copied by other illiberal actors around the world. Or his kind of actions against gay rights and LGBTQ communities. A whole campaigning apparatus built on that, again, influencing American far-right politics. The last point which I wanted to highlight here is really a fascinating case study about how Elon Musk's pet project, the Doge project, the Department of Government Efficiency, which was to kind of eliminate the deep state, there was a proposal to translate that to the European context. So that's the kind of translation through Orbán-funded networks, MCC Brussels, Euronews, propagating it, kind of linking, bringing in American narratives to the European context. So it goes in both directions. The fourth is building the organic intellectuals. And we've already heard about the Matthias Corvinus College. It's amazing, huge institution. It's really mind-boggling. When they received this endowment, that the worth of that endowment exceeded the total budget of the Hungarian total higher education. So it's like you cannot understand the resources that go into these things, which allows them to really also provide really lavish fellowships. But there are other institutions sitting on similar endowments. One of them is the Danube Institute. It's a project of another foundation, but you can see that they're able to invite really prominent American conservative, deep conservative, alt-right intellectuals on lavish fellowships, and then these influence, and they are also commissioned to produce pro-Orbán messages. So this is an internationally upscaled cadre and organic intellectual formation project used to have the kind of the Gramscian organic intellectuals who promote these far-right ideas. The fifth is gaining access, in this case, to American institutions once Trump was in power. So for a long time, Orbán, even under Trump's first presidency, was kind of regarded as a peripheral figure, but he invested, again, enormous resources through lobbying, buying access, both through companies, firms, but also individuals on the Hungarian government payroll to buy access to Trumpian networks. And this largely kind of paid off. You also have this thing called the Hungary Foundation, which is based in the US. They also provide they give funding to the Hudson Institute, which is a major right-wing think tank in the United States, to buy access to the policy pipeline. The Hudson Institute is a key actor in the DC-based policy pipeline. Sixth, coalition brokerage is about creating a power block, counter-hegemonic power block of illiberal actors. We already heard about the European angle, the National Conservatism Conferences, the CPAC Hungary. These are really big, globally ambitious events aiming to not only network in Europe, but also in the transatlantic sphere, inviting key American figures. And here really, I think Vox's efforts to kind of network in the Latin American sphere comes really only close to the ambitions of Viktor Orbán's counter-hegemonic strategy. The next one is laboratory diplomacy, which is presenting or marketing the Hungarian governance model as a laboratory that can be copied. So Orbán's CPAC speech was a really good case study. He actually said, this is how you do it, you can copy it. The Budapest demographic summits are key venues to market the Hungarian family policy model as a way of illiberal statecraft. The Danube geopolitical summit positioned Hungary as a major geopolitical actor. So, and it also creates a policy convergence. So in my study that is behind this presentation, I show multiple instances, but there is actual documented policy convergence towards the United States. And then finally, we have counter-hegemonic financing. Here in Europe, Orbán is really acting as a kind of a patron, funding other far-right actors in France, in Spain, in Slovenia. In US, there's also redistribution going on. So money is being redistributed to the US, but the American actors don't depend on Hungarian funding, but it's used to kind of buy access. But it's nevertheless Hungarian taxpayer money being transferred to the United States. So to summarize, it's also kind of a causal sequence. So this unfolded more or less in a temporal order, but of course not as neatly, because they kind of overlap. Starting from the arbitrage that is exploiting existing institutions through media colonization, narrative translation, producing organic intellectuals, character formation, transactional access, buying access to US institutions, building networks and coalitions, presenting Hungary as the laboratory to laboratory diplomacy, and finally funding, redistributing money to other illiberal actors is the kind of this causal sequence that is being deployed as the counter-hegemonic foreign policy strategy of Orbán. So to conclude, kind of my theoretical argument is that we need to identify this beast as a small state counter-hegemonic foreign policy. There are examples of this, and in my paper I try to compare this to countries like Venezuela. So they do similar things, using the eight mechanisms that I identified. And Hungary is really kind of a front runner, a kind of a laboratory. I wouldn't say it's an outlier. It's more like, at an advanced stage of illiberalism. And if the pro-democracy or liberal kind of actors don't manage to strengthen their positions, I think this kind of shows the future. So I would caution all of us against kind of brushing this off as a minor story. It can be scaled up, and we can already see this happening with the new national security strategy in the US, explicitly aiming of scaling up illiberal actors in Europe. And as Zsuzsanna was saying, much of this is independent from annual state funding. So even if Orbán is up, these are extra governmental fortifications of illiberal counter-hegemony. Of course, the new government can kind of intervene here and there, but this is designed to last. So therefore, anyone interested in kind of combating this needs to have an equally systematic approach. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It is a pleasure to be part of this symposium. So I will talk about, as organizers mentioned, I will talk about Hungary's approach towards the Western Balkans. And I will try to answer the question, what is actually Hungary's interest in this region? So I'll go now straight to the point. We can go to the next slide. So what is Hungary's interest in the Western Balkans? And when I say Hungary, I mean actually Orbán's Hungary, since Orbán came back to power. His main interest regarding the Western Balkans is to maintain, to nurture, and actually to strengthen these relations and close ties with like-minded illiberal allies from the region. Why is this important for Orbán? For many reasons. I mean, let's say like the overall goal of Orbán is to establish Hungary as a regional power in Central and Southeast Europe. And in order to do so, we can go to the next slide. Thank you. In order to do so, he needs these close ties with the Western Balkan leaders, at least some of the Western Balkan countries. Why does he need it? Because if the Western Balkan countries become EU member states, he will have these illiberal allies and he will gain more power within the EU. The second, I would say, is the economic cooperation and joint economic projects, because if he wants Hungary to become a regional power, obviously he needs economic power. And the third that I would mention briefly is just the migration management, because it is also one of the key priorities for Orbán. And before I go into details about these main reasons, maybe I should just say a few words about who those illiberal like-minded allies are in the Western Balkans. And we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So Orbán's closest ties are to Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić, and also Bosnian Serb leader Milorad Dodik, who was until recently president of Republika Srpska, Serb-populated entity of Bosnia and Herzegovina. But also he has close ties with the current ruling party North Macedonia, VMRO-DPMNE, and more precisely with current Macedonian Prime Minister Mickoski. When it comes to relations with the leadership of Montenegro, Albania, and Kosovo, I didn't put them on the presentation because there are relations, and there are plenty of economic investments of Hungary in Albania and Montenegro especially, which I will mention later. But these personal ties that exist, for example, between Orbán and Vučić, are not existent so much in Montenegro and Albania. So that's why I will focus on these three countries: Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, but particularly Republika Srpska, and North Macedonia. Okay, we went to the next slide, never mind. So having in mind these illiberal practices and views for Orbán. Of course, it would be very beneficial if the Western Balkan countries became EU member states, because he would then gain partners that would strengthen his hand in the EU. And because of this, Hungary is very vocal in promoting EU enlargement, but only towards the Western Balkans, which is very telling. He is not advocating for EU accession of Ukraine, for example, but only the Western Balkans under the current leadership. So that is his main goal too, and that's why Orbán often advocates for fast-track EU accession of the Western Balkan countries under the current conditions and with the current leadership in order to have these illiberal allies. Yes, maybe that was particularly clear when Oliver Verhelyi was EU Commissioner for Enlargement, because during his mandate, he was often criticized as loyal Orbán politician who was actually doing more for the interest of Hungary, not the interest of the EU. And for example, he was often criticized, even in the European Parliament, that he softened the rule of law conditions, that he practically shielded Serbia from the more critical voices from Brussels and in the EU annual reports. So he was completely downplaying rule of law conditionality that are essential for candidate countries to be fulfilled. And that's one, let's say, a proof that Hungary was ready to push for fast-track EU enlargement on the Western Balkans, but without caring about rule of law reforms, and only to have these countries in the EU while the current leadership is still in power. And we can go to the next slide. Now that I mentioned Serbia, maybe just a few words about the bilateral relations between Orbán and Vučić. Maybe just the most recent example is that they very much openly support each other in maintaining power. And just, I think last month it was that Vučić was involved in Orbán's parliamentary election campaign. So he appeared in campaign video. Although Fidesz is no longer member of EPP, SNS still is associate member, but nevertheless, Vučić openly supported Fidesz at the upcoming parliamentary election. And that is not the only case. I mean, in previous years, Orbán and Vučić mutually supported each other in election campaigns for many years now. So this is just one example. Maybe to go to Milorad Dodik and Republika Srpska. So until recently, Milorad Dodik was president of Republika Srpska. And for example, what happened and what describes how close these relations are is last year in February 2025, Dodik was sentenced to 1 year in prison and he was banned from politics in general for 6 years. And because he was acting against the constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And authorities in Bosnia issued a national arrest warrant for Dodik, fearing that he might flee the country and might even get asylum in Hungary, as was the case with Macedonian former Prime Minister Gruevski. So because of that, the national arrest warrant was issued, but then Hungary sent a police special operations unit to Republika Srpska, and that included this Hungarian counterterrorism center. So it is like anti-terror unit, which reportedly was there for the joint exercise, but Bosnian authorities were never informed about that, which suggests that Orbán actually sent this unit in case Dodik has to flee the country. So he was ready to help Dodik, even though he was supposed to be arrested. But besides that, and yes, also these units then opened the first offices abroad in Republika Srpska. It was just last month that they opened these offices in Republika Srpska. And besides that, Hungary has consistently supported Dodik. Hungary was the one that blocked EU sanctions on Dodik in 2021. Also, Hungary was the only EU member state in the United Nations that blocked, that actually voted against the UN General Assembly resolution against on the Srebrenica genocide. So practically, Hungary always supported Dodik, and maybe I'll get back to that later about why does Orbán support Dodik so much? What does he get out of it? It has to do something with economics, so maybe I will get back to that later. And yeah, I mean, here I mentioned Gruevski already. He is probably still in Hungary. He has asylum, so yes, and also the migration cooperation. So we can move to the next slide. Yes, I mentioned the economic cooperation here because there are plenty of aspects when it comes to economic cooperation. We don't really have time to get into all of them. But let's say, for example, Serbia. Serbia is the key economic partner for Hungary currently. In the last 2 years, Hungary is among top 5 foreign trade partners. And on these charts, you can see who are Serbia's foreign policy partners. And so in 2023, Hungary was fourth on the list of countries to which Serbia exports. It was 5th in 2024, and also in 2025, it was also in the 5th place. I just didn't have this chart, but I have the data. And when it comes to import, Hungary was 6th country, from which Serbia imports the most in 2023, and 5th in 2024 and 2025. This suggests how much the trade has increased between the two countries in the previous years. But besides trade, Orbán and Vučić have together launched a number of billion-dollar investment projects, such as the high-speed railway link between Budapest and Belgrade, which was financed with Chinese loans. We can also get back to that later if you're interested to learn more about this railway. And the most recent cooperation is in the energy sector, and Hungary puts a lot of emphasis now on the energy sector. Just a couple of days ago, Hungarian Foreign Minister Szijjártó, he announced that Hungary and Serbia will accelerate the preparation work for construction of the new oil pipeline, which is also questionable because how will they import Russian oil now that it will be banned, and there is also the Ukrainian Druzhba oil pipeline is now practically destroyed. So that is very questionable. But besides that, Hungarian energy group, MOL, that Zsuzsanna also mentioned, is buying NIS, which is Serbian oil company. So they signed the agreement, but the acquisition has not yet happened, but it will. And what is actually interesting regarding that is that MOL will buy majority stake, which was Gazprom Neft's, so Russian company was actually the majority owner of NIS. And oh yes, we can go to the next. Yeah, when it comes to Montenegro and Albania, I mentioned briefly, so there are some bilateral agreements that were signed last year, mostly regarding infrastructure projects, but also there is Hungarian companies are already doing work in Montenegro and Albania, such as Hungarian company 4iG. And it is one of the key players in telecommunications market of Hungary and the Western Balkans. And in 2021, this company purchased 100% stake in Telenet Montenegro, which used to be the leading mobile operator in the country. So now 4iG is operating in Montenegro and also in Albania, where 4iG also merged 2 Albanian telecommunication companies into one. But what is interesting here is that we didn't really find any controversies regarding these purchases of 4iG, for example. So there are no corruption schemes like there are with, for example, North Macedonia that I will come to right now. So with North Macedonia, we can go to the next slide, thank you. Yes, Hungary's engagement extends into media sector, and it was driven largely by business figures close to Orbán. So 2 Hungarian media executives purchased media outlets in North Macedonia. These are some of those media outlets, which are completely aligned with governing illiberal views of the ruling party in North Macedonia. And also, investigative journalists revealed that these pro-VMRO media outlets have received indirect financial support through advertising with Hungarian businesses. So this financial backing has helped sustain media networks aligned with Gruevski. And yes, this is also what Gábor mentioned, these deepening financial ties between North Macedonia and Hungary when the Hungarian government extended this 500 million euros loan to Skopje, drawn from 1 billion euros loan secured from China. And yeah, it is a big question actually here. Why did Hungary provide such financial support to their foreign partners when they are themselves having some financial trouble, especially if we take into account that some EU funds have been frozen for Hungary, but we can also get back to that later. What I wanted, we can go to the next slide. Just briefly, I wanted to mention also regarding Republika Srpska that it has taken loans from Hungary's Export-Import Bank. Also, Hungary provided some funds to farmers in Republika Srpska to buy agricultural machinery and so on, but with the condition that those machines have to be produced in Hungary, which is obvious economic rationale behind that, but still what kind of corrupt schemes are behind all of that. I can also get maybe talk about that in the Q&A session because I am running out of time. And maybe just finally, a few words about the migration issue. I think it is important because since the migration crisis in 2014-15, actually that is when the relations between Hungary and the Western Balkan countries have intensified significantly. And that is precisely because of the border where Hungary wants to keep migrants south of Hungarian border, which means Serbia and North Macedonia. And that is why the bilateral relations with these two countries have increased significantly since the migration crisis. And the Western Balkan region is viewed as a crucial partner in managing these migration flows. And since then, Hungary enhanced the bilateral cooperation, so including, the fence was built on the Serbian-Hungarian border. There were joint policing agreements and efforts to contain migration flows to Hungary. So this is just another aspect that should be taken into account when looking at all these aspects, what Orbán wants in the Western Balkans. And I will stop with this. I know that I opened a lot of questions, but we can discuss in more detail during the Q&A session. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for these very insightful presentations. I think they gave us a very, very good overview of this illiberal network that Orbán has been creating. And the plan now is to have a 20-minute panel discussion, so very short, and then we'll open the floor to the audience so you can ask many, many questions. And the first question I would like to ask is a general question to all three of you, namely, do we see differences between the engagement with the EU, the US, and Western Balkans? I know it's a tough question maybe to summarize, but do you see any differences? So between EU, US, and the Western Balkans, so concerning strategies. Who would like to start? Okay, Ivana.
Thank you. I can start. Well, the strategy towards the Western Balkans is, I would say, specific because Hungary is often seen in the Western Balkans as kind of a role model. And role model, not in a positive sense, but we definitely see, let's say, copying of some illiberal practices that Orbán does. And then, for example, Vučić does the same in Serbia, whether it is state capture practices, such as control over media, repression over any critical voices, or so we just actually talked about that, what Orbán is doing now before the parliamentary elections. I was really wondering whether Vučić would do similar if he announces elections in Serbia, whether he would do something similar if he feels that he is shaken and that he might lose the parliamentary elections. So I would say that that is the main point when it comes to Hungary's strategy towards the Western Balkans, that often the leaders from the Western Balkans see Orbán as some kind of a role model. But then again, besides all these ideological similarities that we mentioned, that you saw in the presentation, still what is at the core of these relations are pragmatic interests of both sides, both Hungary and the Western Balkan countries. And yeah, maybe I can, those pragmatic interests, I mean, there are plenty of them, but whether it is economic benefits or just support to maintaining power. So yeah, there are mutual benefits for all these regimes. And yeah, maybe I can then add something if, yeah.
Thank you. What I would maybe highlight is, first of all, a similarity across all three regions, if you will, is that in every case, the Hungarian governing party has politicized the interstate relations with their counterparts. So the political allies are always treated preferably compared to ideological competitors, if you will. At the same time, I think the three regions have different functions and are seen differently by the Hungarian government. The European Union is an organization in which Hungary is a member, and the governing party uses the channels that exist to shape and, according to its intention, to reshape the organization. The Western Balkans is a region where the governing party wants to build influence and where it wants to invest, as Ivana mentioned, into strategic partnerships and infrastructure to project power, but also to build international leverage. And with the United States, I think we really need to differentiate now pre-Trump and the current relations. Under the current conditions, the United States is suddenly seen as an allied source of political support and potentially financial support for the governing party to pursue its international agenda. So whereas up until now, and as it is in the case of the EU and the European Commission, financial resources from the US government were bad, as long as they came through USAID, for example, and NED. Now, the prospect of a financial shield for the Hungarian government from the US is suddenly seen in a very positive light. So EU is an arena to shape, Western Balkans is an arena to build leverage and power. The United States is seen as a potential external sponsor.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think you have an overall strategy, strategic framework of strengthening illiberalism at the global scale as an alternative order. I don't think it's really thought through what it is, but it's an alternative, certainly, to the liberal world order. And they don't want that. Orbán, Trump, they think it's over. And they want to build something new that is more significantly more nationalist, and certainly less rules-based. And that's overarching. But of course, these regions are differently located in the global structures of power. Hence, Orbán's strategy differs to these regions. With the US doesn't need Hungarian funds the same way as kind of when Orbán gives money to the Front National or Vox, they actually kind of can use that very, very well. In a case of the US, Hungary is more like buying access to Trumpian circles. So these are kind of differently located countries, hence the tools will slightly diverge, but the overarching goal is strengthening illiberalism as an alternative to the liberal hegemony that is in crisis.
I would like to continue with Ivana, and we've heard in the presentation of Zsuzsanna that often the contexts are not mostly based on ideology. Not all the topics have to match ideologically. And if we look at the Western Balkans, would you say that the knowledge transfer that's happening there, is this more ideologically or also more strategically?
Thank you. Yeah, I would say that it is more strategically because, well, if we start, let's say, from SNS, the ruling party in Serbia, actually, if we wonder what their ideology is, we don't know. I mean, when they came to power, they started as a pro-European party that was strongly advocating for Serbia to become an EU member state, and now it is completely different. Now Vučić doesn't even want Serbia to become an EU member state, and he has completely shifted the ideology, which is now becoming more far right. I mean, than it was when he came to power. So we definitely see some similarities. We see those illiberal practices, but I would say that it is not because of the ideology. It is more that they share these illiberal practices because they see that works with their voters, and practically the main goal of either Vučić or Orbán or Dodik in Republika Srpska is to maintain in power. And now, even though, when I mentioned now Dodik, even though he is not president of Republika Srpska anymore, still his party, SNSD, the president is from this party, so he still practically has power in his hands. So I would say it is strategically to have mutual support to stay in power, but also to have some personal gains. These economic projects. We now heard how much money Hungary is investing in some Western Balkan countries. We hear those projects like railway construction, how much money China has given to these countries to build it, but still the railway for example, from Hungarian side, it will be opened like tomorrow. So the thing is, all those processes, all those economic projects are non-transparent, and plenty of that money actually goes to pockets of the leaders of these countries. So that is strategical from their point of view to still have the power, to still have economic benefits, and I think it has more to do with that than ideology.
Okay. Zsuzsanna, we've heard that we have this massive investment in education and also academic institutions. Where do all of these people actually go? So what is the idea? Where should this education lead them? Is it for public administration? Is it for party organizations? What do they actually do with all of these people that they train in the sense of their specific illiberal policies?
Well, it's a mix. So on the one hand, I did talk about the Matthias Corvinus Collegium, which is one side of the story, but for a moment to put that aside, to look at the higher education in Hungary. The governing party founded the National University of Public Service, which provides education for the future administrative elite of the country, but also law enforcement and military. So law enforcement, military being in state hands is obviously usual practice, but the university is also strongly connected with the political director of the Prime Minister, Balázs Orbán, who oversees the operation of the university. So although there is very solid work done at the university as well, political influence is very present. And this is indeed for public administration. The Matthias Corvinus Collegium, which also is tied to the political director of the Prime Minister, he's heading its board, is more ideological. It's providing extracurricular education for very talented university students, and there are not really many alternatives for such well-funded programs in Hungary. So from the perspective of students, these are really offering excellent opportunities to benefit from also international exchanges, go study abroad that these organizations support. But also they do have ties in the Carpathian Basin with various locations in cities, towns that are in areas populated by the Hungarian minority. So another thing that this organization serves is to educate Hungarians living abroad in institutions that are tied to the government that does provide some sort of worldview as well. So not everybody is going into the party, not everybody is going into state administration. It's more about transferring a way of thinking about the world, a way of thinking about Hungary, and thereby pursuing a broader cultural mission through education.
Are they also sent? Are they also sent to Western European universities, like trained, and then they apply in other EU countries, for example?
People have freedom to pursue their careers, so that's one possibility. But there are certain programs of the Matthias Corvinus College that are Western-oriented. The Matthias Corvinus College, for example, sponsors places in a Berlin-based university for Hungarian students. There is a university in Austria that the Matthias Corvinus College recently bought, the Modul University. So that is just to show also that the programs really span from primary school, where pupils get extracurricular education activities. It's also community building, but also it goes up to university. And then there are, of course, all the fellowships that don't just support Hungarians to go abroad, but also foreigners to come to Hungary that Gábor talked about.
If we look now a bit more critical at what has come out of this, so when we've heard of this investment, especially in the American ties that Orbán did, would you say that Orbán was actually successful with it? Is he happy with his relationship to Trump? Because when you look at the international scene, you see him very often with Mr. Milei, for example, but Viktor Orbán doesn't seem to feature that prominently anymore there, or would you disagree?
Yeah, so it depends on how you define success. And so I think with all these institutions, Orbán's strategy is on the one hand really long term. So he really thinks that he needs a new set of organic intellectuals across the whole kind of range of elite institutions, public service, theaters, universities, corporations. He wants to have intellectuals there trained to understand, at least not hostile to illiberalism, or even kind of well-versed in his kind of nationalist logic. And if you define success as having access to these networks transnationally and in the US, and being able to present Hungary as a laboratory, then you could say it's successful. However, if you look at actual concessions, I would say that the short-term kind of outcomes are really meager of this. So he could kind of achieve a 1-year extension on the sanctions against importing Russian fossil fuels. Beyond that, at the real dimension, in the real dimension, nothing is really there. There's a lot of discursive, praise. Rubio came. Trump endorses Orbán, so I wouldn't brush this off completely, but really in a real sense, America first is America first, and Hungary first is something different. So I think it's much more contradictory than it looks, and that's why it's also really hard to translate these symbolic kind of alignments into direct gains. That's why I think it's easy to oppose the liberal world order. But what these people are building is just leading to an ever more escalating set of nationalisms. So, good luck trying to convince a Danish nationalist that the American hard right is their best friend, right? So Hungary also, when it comes to trade, Trump taxing or putting barriers against the European car exports, Hungary is one of the most important kind of assembly plants for German cars. So immediately that hurts the Hungarian economy. So America first and Hungary first put in completely different directions. So long-term symbolic alignment to produce this kind of all the organic intellectuals or whatever new common sense for illiberalism, I think he really has gotten really far with that. But in real terms, there are a lot of contradictions.
Maybe just a very brief follow-up. We're seeing now the elections are approaching, and the competitor is leading the polls, and Trump is not so close probably with Orbán anymore. But the thing is successful. So are we heading towards an Orbanism without Orbán on a fast track?
Well, it's a really tricky situation. I don't think it's going to be Orbanism without Orbán as such. I think if you look at kind of Peter Magyar and his party's kind of declarations, it's more in a kind of the early Fidesz, kind of really in the kind of the Atlanticist, centrist kind of conservative liberal tradition. Policy realm is really pragmatic, and some of my more progressive social democratic lefty friends are kind of also seeing the kind of the investing in education, health, those sort of things. So I think it's not like it's not just a simple change in prime minister. I think it's also a systemic change, but not a huge change, right? So we're talking about people who are coming from the Fidesz world, but I wouldn't want to downplay the significance of that. I think it would really open the doors and it would bring fresh air, not just in Hungary, but also internationally. So I'm not the biggest fan of the current leader of the opposition, but I do think that it would be a huge kind of step ahead.
Okay, Zsuzsi would like to add something.
Yes, if I may, just a two-finger on the engagement from the US side with Orbán and the potential change if there is a change in the government. So regarding recent developments in the bilateral relations, I think what Orbán has managed to achieve were the big symbolic steps. Gábor also mentioned the support for Orbán, also the removal of Minister Antal Rogán from a sanction list that he was placed on by the Biden administration. That is quite significant. It never happened before that the United States would place the minister responsible for the intelligence services of a NATO ally on an American sanction list. So that is gone. The reinstatement, for example, however, which is a tangible thing of the agreement on the avoidance of dual taxation, which would be important for the economic relations of the two countries, is still not done. And where the Americans are particularly now interested is actually the energy field in Hungary. And they are pushing the Hungarian government, whereas they gave the concession on the fossil import, to diversify away from Russia. So indeed, there is a conflict between America first and Hungary first. And in this particular regard, the Hungarian government is under pressure, however nicely they wrap it up, by the American administration. Now, what would happen if there is a new government led by Péter Magyar? I think precisely the energy field would be where there could be continuity, actually, and where the American administration would be very happy to cooperate with the type of vision that the current opposition put forward about energy diversification of Hungary. So as much as there is an ideological affinity between MAGA and the Hungarian government, the American administration would not turn its back on a new Hungarian government, because in very hard policy fields, interests could actually even align more than with the Orbán administration. Whereas the ideology, well, they could continue cooperation. Certain segments of the administration would certainly welcome that, but this could work on parallel tracks.
Okay, one question to wrap up this brief panel discussion. We've heard that Péter Magyar is really far ahead in the polls and he has good chances of winning these elections. And Zsuzsi already mentioned that this network that Orbán has built is likely not to disappear. And I agree, it will not disappear. But what will then happen? Will we see a kind of parallel foreign policy if there is a government change? What would you say? And the question is to all three of you.
So first, although I mean the opposition is leading currently, and the gap is actually opening up, there's still always opportunity for Orbán to really do hard steps, stopping the government change actually from happening. I'm not certain if that's really likely, but I also wouldn't rule that out. So just to keep that in mind, I think it's on the table. And then the big question is whether they just simply lose, or lose really so much that the new government would have a qualified supermajority. Because in that case, they could not only change a series of laws that are tied to two-thirds majority in the legislature, but they would have a symbolic kind of legitimacy to do things that are otherwise really hard to do. So I think that's a really big question. Having said that, even if the new government has two-thirds majority, and some of the investors that Orbán has created, the national oligarchs, will certainly find ways to cooperate with the new leadership. But they have their own money. They have assets. They have endowed foundations that will continue working in the same kind of ideological line, and I think they're prepared to fight back and make the life of a new administration as hard as possible. And if you look at Poland, I mean, it's really hard to kind of re-democratize a country, and then you lose the presidency. So it's really hard to kind of see how it's going to be sustainable in the long run to re-democratize the country. I'm rooting for this to happen, but it's an extreme challenge. And in the foreign policy area, I don't think these are not state institutions, but they certainly will be there as assets that can be activated and used to put pressure on the government, on the new administration, if there's going to be a new one, and then their hope would be to be able to come back and do it again, this time even more forcefully.
Well, this is a question that I have thought about a lot, and I would say that definitely some things would change if the new government in Hungary is established, because relations between Orbán and Vučić or Dodik are very much personal. And maybe I could illustrate that on the example of a Hungarian minority in Vojvodina. Vojvodina is an autonomous province in Serbia where less than 200,000 Hungarians live. And so both the governments in Hungary and Serbia, they are saying for years now that they work on improvement of Hungarian minority, their position in Serbia and so on. And of course, both leaders are always saying that the relations have never been better. This is a historical reconciliation among Hungarians and Serbians. However, if you go in Vojvodina and talk to people, obviously they don't have any issues among each other, but it feels like they live next to each other and not with each other. So that is an example of how relations are very much personal. Again, I said that there are strategic priorities of Hungary towards the Western Balkans, but still they are very much based on these personal relations and how the leaders would gain personal benefits out of these relations. But for example, so some of that would change definitely, but for example, the economic investments in the Western Balkan countries, I believe that will maintain, because why not? And also cooperation in the energy sector would, I think, remain. But definitely those projects that were very non-transparent, that involved some corruption because it was based on personal deals between Vučić and Orbán, or Orbán and Dodik, I believe that would change if the government changes in Hungary.
I fully agree with what has been said by Gábor and Ivana. So maybe just very briefly to complement a little bit in the Balkan context. I think one interesting feature has been here is that financial support towards allies has been very often through state loans. And I do not think that that practice would continue under a new non-Fidesz government in the same ways. But potential other financial engagement, either through banks in the hands of Fidesz cronies, could potentially continue both in this region and in Europe in general. When it comes to strategic orientation, I think we would see ultimately quite significant changes under Péter Magyar's government should it come to power. But one thing to note is that it would still be a center-right sovereigntist government and not a Euro-federalist one. So there would be still conflict potential with European partners, although possibly a more constructive engagement. And in parallel to that, I think, as Gábor also mentioned, there are the non-state institutions with their endowments. As long as there is no step taken to, for example, possibly renationalize the stock package that Matthias Corvinus received, that can continue on as a parallel foreign policy track, obviously not in the diplomatic sense to really influence state policy, but to uphold the engagement with political allies and also the intellectual circles that have been developed. Just like Orbán has continued engagement with his allies when they were not in power, I think the network is socialized for the eventuality that some of its constituents are not in power and continue cooperation. So I would think that this will continue here as well.
Okay, thank you very much. I think there might be quite a lot of questions, so I suggest opening up to the audience. So if you've got any question, just raise your hand. Yes. Oh, many questions. But you were first.
And maybe also for our online participants, you can also ask questions in written. We will collect them and then feed them in the final round. And probably we collect 3 questions or so.
Thanks a lot. And totally following the focus of the event, it was about transnational alliances with a focus on Orbán's relations to the United States. But do we really see the whole picture if we don't also introduce Russia more prominently? It was mentioned with oil and gas, but it's concerned, of course, also the discourses, illiberalism, sovereignty, and Eurasia, for example.
Thank you. And Jens Bastian is like coming from the behind. Hans, could you give the next one?
Hello, Jens Bastian. I'm a member of the board of the Southeast Europe Association. Following up on the question that was just also asked, it's more of a comment, I think, in terms of transnational alliance. Excuse me? In terms of transnational alliance, I think what you've highlighted is very much how such an alliance has turned from an asset into a liability in Hungary. My question is one that Gábor touched just at the end, returning to Poland. The transition to re-democratize, to liberalize an institutional, a political system, also the economy. It may be appropriate that the leader of the opposition has a number of phone calls with his Polish counterpart in terms of calling Donald Tusk. What can, and please be more specific, what could we learn from Poland in order to assist that transition process in Hungary? Thank you.
Thank you. I think we can take 2 more. Gudrun Steinacker here in the front. Hans? Yeah. Yes.
Thank you, Gudrun Steinacker, also SOG. First of all, thank you for your very comprehensive presentations. I would like to mention only a name and ask you if you know her, Magdalena Marsowski, who wrote a lot about this, the basic ideology of in Hungary now as an ethnic racial ideology. And my question would be, but what should the EU, or what did the EU not do to react to these developments, which are very clearly detrimental to the EU and also individual EU states? You mentioned Germany with a lot of investments in Hungary. Why, at least for me as an observer, is the reaction so weak?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes, Klaus Buchenau, I think.
Yeah, but my question also goes to Gábor Scheiring. He just used this very interesting expression, the organic intellectual. So what is an organic intellectual in contrast to the unorganic intellectual?
And Gregor Meyer in the front. And then we will do a second round afterwards.
Yeah, I'm Gregor Meyer, the correspondent for German press agency in Belgrade and Budapest. My question is, what should be the strategy of the remaining liberal world order in fighting such a factor like Viktor Orbán, who is, let's speak about Europe only, European Union, who is obviously undermining the union, bringing it to the collapse of actionability and bringing it basically, neutralizing it completely, making it irrelevant as an actor, though it is representing still a very considerable market economy.
Okay, thank you. So we have 5 questions now. I repeat them briefly. So what about Russia? What can we learn from Poland for redemocratization? What did the EU fail to react to these developments? What could be an EU strategy against Orbán? And how do we have to feed an intellectual that he becomes organic? So we can just make a... Would you like to start with this? Or I don't know.
So, well, these are really amazing questions, and I think it's impossible, obviously, to resolve any of these. Just a few points, maybe. Let me just combine the last. What should the liberal world order, whatever remnants of that, do, and what can we learn from efforts to re-democratize Poland? I would like kind of read these as pointing in the same direction, and I think there are short and long-term answers to this, and I think one of the most important aspects here is that pro-democracy, liberal, progressive forces, pick your favorite term, I think are too much on the defense of something that is in the past. This 90s in Europe era of the hegemony of liberalism, the end of the history, it was always kind of built on a set of contradictions that led to a loss of legitimacy, a loss of trust by vast masses of people losing trust in political institutions, growing inequalities, stagnation of real wages in Germany, in Hungary. Around 2010, middle classes had lower wages, real wages, than they had in the 80s. So you have a series of problems associated with this world that need solutions within the confines of democracy. And today, unfortunately, it's the far right that is positions itself as a force of change, whereas democratic forces appear as trying to defend something that is, for many, many people, problematic for economic, culture, social, political reasons. So I think we shouldn't want to go back, but we need to have a vision for what I call democracy 2.0. New institutions, more participatory institutions at the local governmental level, more deliberation, bringing in people. In terms of the economy, pay more attention to cost of living crisis, more democracy also in how the economy is governed. So it's really short and long-term issues. It's policies as well as at the symbolic level. So very often pro-democracy forces sound like, when I read out my Excel sheet in my kind of computer, and then you have this kind of AI voice that sounds like a computer. So it's too technocratic, in other words. So I think we need a more human-centered pro-democracy forces that know how to speak symbolic language, build communities, build identity. I think pro-democracy forces weren't really good at that, Everyone who has a vision should go see the doctor. We're in Germany, you know what I'm referring to. I don't think this is a good idea. I think we need visionary leadership that proposes transformation, but in a way that is making democracy more and not less democratic. So these are really big words, but I think we really need to grasp the severity of this crisis. So I think that's what we are seeing also in the case of Poland, that it's a bit like too defensive and not. I don't see the kind of the visionary impetus emerging there. So people getting tired with that agenda. I think that's really perhaps the most important to understand the severity of the problem and there to think big in terms of transformative vision. And in terms of organic intellectuals, this is a Gramscian term. So it's really about, for Gramsci, it was about class. So the organic intellectuals are attached to a specific class. But maybe today you could say these are intellectuals embedded in specific power projects who form specific social coalitions and provide the network and intellectual foundations for those social coalitions to emerge. So you have organic intellectuals who do liberal work, and you have organic intellectuals being produced by a new illiberal world order to kind of consolidate those institutions. So the Gramscian paradigm, power is both kind of based on resources, finance, money, but also in elites' ability to control hearts and minds. And that's really the role of organic intellectuals. They are embedded in specific power projects. So that's why Orbán is producing these so-called, so you could say it's a kind of cadre formation for a really broad swath of economic and cultural institutions and political institutions.
I can say a few words about Russia, which I agree is very important in this equation of all these countries and Hungarian influence in the Western Balkans. Russia and China also are important for a few reasons. First of all, Hungary, I think that actually one of the reasons why Orbán maintains close relations, for example, with Dodik, is because of Dodik's ties to Putin. Also, Vučić obviously is. It just came to my mind that now a few days ago, when it was anniversary of the beginning of the Ukrainian war, in Belgrade there were Russians who were pro-Ukrainian, and there were Serbian people who were pro-Russian, and then they started fighting. So I mean, you can imagine how much pro-Russian narratives are there in Serbia. And Russia is very important to Serbian people. The pro-Russian narratives are very much promoted, but not by Russia, but by pro-government media and the government itself. And why I'm saying all of this? Because I think that because by maintaining relations with Serbia or Republika Srpska, who are, I mean, Bosnia and Herzegovina, who are not members of the EU, Hungary can kind of circumvent sanctions, for example, that the EU has imposed to Russia. And also why I mentioned China as well, because if China wants to invest something, wants to build some infrastructure projects in Serbia, the non-transparency is not an issue. In Serbia, no one asks you about how the project is being developed and are all the is everything by the law. But in Hungary, which is an EU member state, there are certain rules that must be obeyed, and that is exactly why the railway that I mentioned between Belgrade and Budapest, why on the Hungarian side it was built much later than on the Serbian side, because of certain EU regulations. Exactly. Thank you. So that is why Western Balkans are also important for Hungary, to circumvent, to find a shortcut to implementing some of the infrastructure projects or some other projects. So that is regarding Russia, and the questions about what did EU not do to prevent these developments, I cannot say about Hungary, but I can say about the Western Balkans, because these are also the countries, especially Serbia, that are completely became authoritarian countries, and as EU candidate countries that are supposed to become more democratic and that are supposed to fulfill all the rule of law criteria and reforms, Serbia has done the opposite. And what is EU doing about it? That is our question for many years now, and what we experienced is that the EU has the only goal of the EU was to maintain stability in the Western Balkan region, and we call it stabilitocracy. So for the sake of stability in the region, the EU will close one eye on the rule of law and the democratic backsliding, which obviously now got us to this situation when we have a completely authoritarian government and plus no stability, because currently there are massive protests in Serbia. Half of the citizens are against the government, so it is everything but not stable. However, the EU is still not completely decisive about saying no to Vučić and just, let's say, turning back on him, let's say. So, yeah, what can the EU do? I mean, I wouldn't exclude sanctions towards some leaders like Vučić, for example, Vulin, who was Minister of Defense, and he had many positions. He is under US sanctions. So some of maybe more concrete punishments and more concrete conditionality, maybe that would benefit. Yeah, I think that is it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I will try to touch on a couple points very briefly. On Russia, I think that's a very important point to raise. Russia's role in the network, I think, is very interesting because as opposed to the type of overt networking of the far right that we see nowadays and the type of overt funding from the Hungarians, and also potentially if we will see that from the United States, the maybe not funding, but the overt intervention sharply differs from the type of covert interference that we have seen from Russia in these networks for decades. But with Hungary at the core of the liberal network in Europe, we have Russia at the core of that illiberal network, the Hungarian government acting really as, speaking of asset versus liability, as an asset of the Kremlin. So indeed, there's a central role there. On the EU, and I would connect this with the what can be a democratic counter strategy to counter the illiberal counter strategy. I would take the institutional, structural, and the political angle. On the EU level, I think one of the reasons for the slow and weak reaction has been the fact that the EU institutions for a very long time did not treat the Hungarian challenge as systemic. It was addressed in bits and pieces with the very fragmented toolkit of the European Union as if it was sort of a legal challenge. It's not. It's a systemic structural challenge, and the European Union didn't have the toolkit to address that. There is a shift, which I do find promising, but I acknowledge that it comes way, way too late, is the conditionality procedure that ties rule of law, democratic compliance to be in place to the disbursement of EU funds. And that finally does hit where it hurts in the case of Hungary, because the construction of the illiberal state in Hungary, including the crony networks being put in place, and then the funding of the illiberal networking was actually done through EU resources. Yeah. And that is now at least curtailed. But this comes late. Now, what can be done? This sort of conditionality needs to be in place, and needs to be in place also for the next budget, also because it may not only be Hungary where such forces come into power, and you have a much harder situation if it's no longer a net beneficiary, but a net contributor, where illiberal forces are starting to challenge the institutions. So we need a lot more systemic structural attention. On the political side, I fully agree with Gábor's assessment about the need for a vision. What I think is not fully acknowledged and acted upon, again, the systemic challenge. It's no longer just the standard political competition between forces on the left, on the center right, on the far right. No, the far right is a systemic challenge to democracy, yet democratic forces remain fragmented and they continue to play politics as if the far right was a player like them. There is a strong normalization of the far right with its rise in support, but it is still a challenge to the system. And if so, then democratic forces do need to double down and unite around certain democratic principles, which should be the foundation for a democratic vision that can nonetheless still maintain plurality. And in this whole constellation, I just want to highlight the really central role of the center right, the mainstream right, because for democracy, liberal democracy to survive, I really believe that the center right has a massive responsibility to not co-opt the far right's ideas, rhetoric, and policy, because if there is at least one thing that sort of academics agree on who study the far right's influence and this interaction in general, is that the copycat mentality of the center right to sort of preserve its positions and curtail the far right never works. It does actually enforce the far right parties. So the center right does need to remain center right. It needs to maintain a cordon sanitaire, also in its rhetoric and also in its policy agendas, and offer an alternative vision, not just adopt the far right seemingly successful but otherwise quite empty policy propositions.
Yeah, just one very brief comment on the EU, which is following up on like, this is really a big political and structure question about what is Europe as a long-term historical, political, and intellectual project. And if I may just like sharpen this dilemma, when there was an elected government that wanted to renegotiate its debt, there was fierce and immediate action against the Syriza-led Greek government. Very fierce, very immediate European unity when it came to financial interests. When it came to Hungary, for 10 years, led by the European People's Party, European elites protected and shielded Hungary because the financial and profit interests at the heart of European elites dictated so. So what is Europe? Is Europe a community of profit-interested corporations and their political friends? Or is it a force for inclusion and democracy with an appropriate vision and willingness to act? In the case of Greece, it was able and willing to act. When it comes to the crisis of democracy, it seems to just stand by. Now it's changing after Russia's invasion of Ukraine for the good, but I think it really needs to be much more systematic. And it's a big intellectual and political problem.
Okay, I'm afraid we've run out of time, although I'm sure there are many more questions, but I guess, or I hope that the speakers are ready to answer some more questions over a coffee outside. And maybe just to wrap up the discussion, could you all please say a concluding sentence, something that we can have as a takeaway from this round of discussion?
Question. Yeah, definitely. Although one should be prepared for this question by now. Okay, so I think what I would highlight from the nature of this international networking is that we need to be aware that today's far right and today's far right network is not the same as it was in the 1990s or the 2000s. The far right parties are much more professionalized. They are socialized into politics, political institutions, and they are actively seeking out shared points where they can connect, because it does bring very tangible benefits that they are very aware of. And they want to capitalize on that. They are office seekers, not disruptors anymore, which also means that they do their best to maintain the networks and the alliance. So for that reasons, even if we see that they do not align precisely on policies, we should not dismiss this cooperation as unsuccessful. Success in this case is not about a shared proactive and positive policy vision, but it's about the maintenance and long-term shaping of the political agenda that will remain in place in the next political cycles too.
I can conclude with maybe a suggestion to the European Union to not let more Hungaries in the EU, meaning that these types of regimes in the Western Balkans with these authoritarian regimes should not become EU member states. The EU enlargement should be merit-based approach, not only because of the geopolitics, but rule of law conditionality should be priority in order to avoid the scenario that Orbán is wishing for, actually, to have illiberal allies within the EU. So, I mean, yeah, I know it is difficult, especially having in mind everything, the geopolitical situation, but merit-based approach of EU accession, that is my main conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think the far right and the liberalism is a major political but also intellectual challenge. And I think pro-democracy forces have not really faced the severity and the structural nature of this challenge, and also fail to recognize the kind of the structural crisis of democracy as we knew it. And I think there's no way back to that kind of 90s era. So that's the kind of the shocking news. But then the good news is that I think Ukraine and then Trump in the White House have kind of waken up Europe from its long slumber slowly. So there is still time to act. But if this action is not going to be transformative and systemic, then I think the momentum will be lost again, and illiberalism will have a second and third chance and coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for putting also hope in this final statement. And yes, this is it with our scientific symposium for this year. So give a big applause for our panel.